Good day, everyone. Welcome to the next in our series of walking through the Bible. And I'm sorry for last week. I just had way too much stuff that I ended up needing to do. And so we're picking this up now this week. And this week I'd like to speak on the Apostle Paul. We'll be looking into the letters of Paul in subsequent weeks, but he is such a significant figure in the New Testament that it seemed like it would be a good idea just to look at his life before we delve into the message of each of his letters. Now, it would not be a stretch to say that Paul was the most influential person in Christian history, if not the most important. I still think that the title of most important obviously goes to Jesus, but as we said in the series on the Gospels, Jesus did not write down any of his teachings. And actually, Paul's writings are older than all of the Gospels. The Gospels were written down probably between the mid-60s to the mid-90s AD, whereas Paul's writings, we think he was active from maybe the early 50s or so into the mid-60s. Also, half of the New Testament writings are attributed to Paul, and his writings probably have the greatest influence on Christian theology, doctrine, and worship. A few things about Paul and his life. Details about Paul's early life are mostly unknown from Bible accounts. Okay? We don't have biblical accounts of Paul's early life. According to Acts 22:3, Paul himself said that he was born in Tarsus, a city, major center of trade on the southern coast of what is now Turkey. In the same passage in Acts, Paul says that he was actually raised in Jerusalem. So born in Tarsus, but raised in Jerusalem, and he studied under this guy named Gamaliel, okay, who was one of the greatest teachers in Judaism, a very powerful member of the Sanhedrin, which is the highest court in Judaism. Now, although Paul himself never mentions this in his letters, he is portrayed in both the letters and the book of Acts as someone who is very familiar with Jewish law and practice. In Philippians, Paul briefly discusses his background. He claims to be from a pure Hebrew family, is circumcised on the 8th day, and a member of the Pharisees. Something that's interesting is that Paul never renounces his claim to be a Pharisee. Okay, he always saw himself as one, even after his conversion to belief in Jesus. We see that Paul still has, even after he meets Jesus and converts to belief in Jesus, after he starts preaching about Jesus, he still considers himself as a Jew. In Romans chapters 9 through 11, that really hard section in Romans that we typically skip over, Paul talks about his passion for the Jewish people and his belief that all of the Jews will come to believe in Jesus. Now, probably the most famous story about Paul is his conversion experience. Paul never writes about this in detail in his letters, although he does write about his calling in several letters and a little bit about his history. Okay, in the letters, he does mention that he was an enemy and the persecutor of the church there in Galatians chapter 1. And he says that this was until he received a revelation of Jesus similar to that of the apostles after Jesus' resurrection. And he talks about the calling that Jesus gave to him in 1 Corinthians 15. It is not in the letters of Paul that we get any details about this. He doesn't say anything about what the experience was. He doesn't say anything about what Jesus said to him in this conversion experience. But it's in Acts chapter 9 that we get these details. That's the account of this famous Damascus Road experience, where Paul was intercepted on the road to Damascus by a vision of the resurrected Jesus, right? Literally blindsided on this road, on his way to go and persecute Christians. he suddenly has this vision of Jesus, and his glory was so great that he was blinded, but he was able to speak directly to Jesus. And in this vision, Jesus gave him this mission. He said, you're going to serve me. And he later on, when his sight was restored, that was when he got this full understanding of what that mission was. His mission then was to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles. So when his sight got restored, then that kind of represented, literally like his eyes being open, and then he began to preach about Jesus. This experience represented a complete and radical turnaround in Saul's life, at least in his focus and his mission. If you look at the way that he went about his life, maybe not so much of a difference. He was extremely zealous before for defending Judaism and persecuting the Christians. Then he just kind of turned around, and he was still just as zealous as before, but this time now he's promoting the message of Jesus and building up the church. In Paul's own words, here in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, "For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace towards me has not been in vain." So that's a little bit in Paul's own words about how he understood this conversion experience and this new life that God had given him. Now, there are two pieces of misinformation about Paul's life that I'd like to talk about here. And they both center around this conversion experience. It has been said that before his conversion, he was named Saul. Then after his conversion, to sort of signify his new life, he took this new name and he became Paul. In actuality, Saul was his Hebrew name, and Paul was simply this Romanized form. And it was very common during this time for Jews who were also Roman citizens to have both Jewish and Roman names. So he may have had two names, or he may have just, when he started working with the Gentiles, he took this Romanized name so he could better, relate to them. It wasn't so much that he changed his name, it's just one was a Hebrew name, and then the next one was the Romanized form of that Hebrew name. Now, it is true that Acts 9 refers to him as Saul, and then it kind of switches back and forth between Saul and Peter, but from Acts 9, it calls him Saul, but then the middle of Acts 13 and onward, from then in Acts, he is referred to as Paul, and this change kind of happens abruptly. It actually happens right in the middle of the chapter, but the name change happens as a result of his missionary journeys and his focus on the Gentile mission. Okay, when Paul begins his missionary activity, that's when Acts changes and refers to him as Paul. It's less a symbol of his conversion and more of a kind of his own understanding of his mission. Okay, when he was a Jew, and when he was, even after he was converted, but he was active around Jewish communities, he went by Saul. As soon as he changes that mission and he starts going out and preaching to Gentiles, then he starts using this Roman name, Paul. Okay, we actually see a similar thing with Paul's frequent companion, another apostle named Silas. He is addressed as Silas in Acts when we're hearing about some of these journeys that he took with Paul, but he's also referred to with the Romanized name Silvanus. So Silas also is an example of this. People who had two names, and apparently they used them maybe in different contexts, however would help them to reach out and accomplish their mission. Now, the second misinformation comes about when discussing Paul's conversion is this idea that he became an active apostle and he was like doing all this missionary work immediately after his conversion. Now, Instead, it says that after the Damascus Road vision and conversion, he actually spent a period of several years. It says 3 years in Arabia and then Damascus. So those are still kind of provinces around Israel there in Palestine. Paul also speaks of a period of 14 years during which he was active in the provinces of Syria and Cilicia. These are regions kind of just north of Israel going up into Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. And so, yeah, Paul had this conversion, but it's not like right after his conversion, he was just like, hey, I know everything there is to know about Jesus. Now I'm just going to go and preach to the Gentiles, and he started sailing all over the place. Okay, in reality, it seems that Paul took a lot of time to study and learn about the Christian faith, learning the stories about Jesus and what they meant for the church. He probably was also developing his missionary skills. At the end of Acts chapter 9, it does say that he was preaching in various places and even to Jewish people now who were super shocked to see that this guy who hated Christians so much and he was persecuting the church now had turned around and was preaching about Jesus as the Son of God. But these were still in Jewish contexts. And he apparently, was kind of operating in a localized area there around Israel. This might have also been the time that he kind of developed this revolutionary understanding that Gentiles did not have to become Jews in order to be saved in Christ. That for the Gentiles there was actually this kind of distinct identity that they could become Christians without becoming Jews, without becoming circumcised. And he certainly comes out like firing on all cylinders with that in all of his letters. And so it seems like, this understanding and this belief didn't come out of nowhere. And so it must have been maybe during this time, either the 3 years right after his conversion or these 14 years that he had spent sort of traveling as a local missionary. Okay. And maybe that tells us something, about for people who have maybe a very ecstatic and very dramatic conversion experience. We certainly don't want to throw water on their fire for God, but it is still a profitable thing for people who have this dramatic conversion to spend some years learning, about what it means to be a Christian. Because as I have discussed a lot, it's very common for people to have this extremely emotional, powerful, ecstatic experience of conversion, and right afterwards, where it seems like God is so real that every waking thought that you have is about God, and God is so real that you can like see, smell, feel, taste Him. But then that kind of dies out, and to cultivate some roots, to cultivate like a deeper understanding of faith, it's a good idea to have some, instruction and to take some time in learning about Jesus and what Jesus has meant, not only for oneself personally, but for the Christian church, for the community, and throughout history. Now, the thing that Paul is probably most associated with in Christian history are his great missionary journeys. And I think it's very interesting to take a closer look into just how he went about planning and executing these. Major cities along important trade routes seem to have been his primary targets. While he went many places during his journeys, there are 4 places that end up being mentioned repeatedly as places where Paul either went to and ministered, or he kind of used them as bases of operation, and then he'd go out and kind of in the area. These cities were all sort of these very large, cosmopolitan, very diverse cities. Okay, they had strong Jewish presence there, but then also they had a lot of Gentiles. They had people from all over the empire. And so something that a lot of these cities have in mind is that they're full of people that are open to new ideas. a lot of religious diversity, a lot of pluralism, because then people would be open to new ideas. And Paul seemed to understand that in these large kind of new cities, where you had newer populations coming in from all over the empire, there would be people who were seeking kind of a new spiritual experience or a deeper understanding of the truth. And so he went to these places because he knew that this kind of new message about Jesus would find kind of prime soil to develop. Okay, now these four places that he is associated with very strongly are the cities of Ephesus over in Asia Minor, which is now called Turkey. I've circled all of these in red so that you can see them easily. Ephesus there on the west coast of what is Turkey, alongside the Meander River there. Then going pretty much straight across, you see the city of Corinth in Greece. And of course, Paul wrote two very important and very famous letters to the Corinthians. Then going up north from Corinth, you have the city of Thessalonica. Currently, in modern Greek, it is called Thessaloniki, and the city is still there, and there are some ruins there. And then going across kind of a little bit north and east of Thessalonica is the city of Philippi. Okay? And so all of these places are, again, these kind of very diverse cosmopolitan cities. They are along these important trade routes. Very easy to get in and out. As you can see, those four major cities there, all sort of very close by the coast. So you have easy access to ship travel, but then they also had major roads going in and out of them too. So a lot of ways in and out of these cities, a lot of ways to come and go, many different routes, transportation options. Okay, and so that seems to be what Paul was looking for. They're easily accessible cities with diverse and spiritually seeking populations. Now, there is this image of Paul as this kind of lone wolf, right? That he was going all over these places, traveling, working alone, writing all of these letters to these cities. But in fact, Paul most frequently worked as part of a missionary team. He had a lot of people working with him, and he depended on a lot of different people. He frequently worked with Timothy and Titus. He traveled with them, and he also sent them as kind of troubleshooters. You hear of him saying, like, to these different churches, "I've heard you have this problem. I'm going to send Timothy to you," or I'm sending Titus with you to you with this message from me. So Timothy and Titus worked very closely with him. He was apparently this sort of mentor to Timothy. And then Barnabas and Silas also accompanied him in his missionary journeys. Very important companions of Paul, and they went through a lot of things with him in the stories in Acts. However, besides these four that were kind of his closest companions and co-workers, he also had many other associates and people that he called fellow workers. And these people are all mentioned in the letters, sometimes a few times in his letters. But some of those people are it's a married couple, it seems, Priscilla and Aquila. Then you have Euodia and Syntyche, two women who worked in the church in Philippi and whom Paul addresses by name in the letter to the Philippians. Also from Philippians, you have this person Epaphroditus, and then Luke also. Luke, Mark, Demas, some of these other names of people who apparently worked closely with Paul or were his companions at different times. A number of other people, especially, it's interesting that there are a lot of women who Paul names as supporting him, helping him, even working with him. Okay, an interesting thing about Paul and his teams is how they operated once they got to a city. We think that there were these kind of trade houses that were available even for rent. and people could go into a city, these traveling merchants could go into a city and set up shop in these houses and rent them for a period of, a month or a few months. And it seems that Paul was a tent maker. In Acts 18, verse 3, it mentions this. Paul was working as a tent maker, and it seems that one of his strategies in his journeys was to get one of these temporary shops, and he would set up shop in this town with his fellow workers there, with his team, and he would actually practice his trade. He did this because he was very sensitive about not asking the local churches for money. And so because he was able to support himself and his missionary team, he didn't have to depend then on the church members to support him and give him money. It seems that Paul, again, he was really sensitive about this. He did not want to become a burden to the local churches that he planted and he ministered to. We have to keep in mind that some of these churches may have started out as not even churches, but just these really small house assemblies of only a handful of people at first. And we know for a fact that a number of the early Christians were slaves. So these would not have been people that were rich, who were self-supporting in any way. And so Paul did not want to burden them further by depending on them for his living. In some of his letters, in I think it's 1st and 2nd Corinthians, he does mention that this is a right of his as an apostle. Okay, he could go to these places as the person who is bringing the gospel and preaching the gospel to them, and he could tell them, you have to support me, but he really didn't want to do that. And he mentions repeatedly in his letters that he does not want to do this, and he is avoiding this, even though it is his right. He is not going to burden people with that. He maybe was aware that some of these new or potential converts might have been suspicious of his motives. Right? Somebody comes preaching this new message about a new religion and a savior, but then they're also, with their other hand, asking for money. Hey, we're going to get suspicious of their motives, right? Preach the gospel and then ask us immediately for a handout. That's not so great. And so Paul seems to have been very aware of this, and he was very interested in avoiding any, appearance of freeloading or any kind of, impropriety there. As for an overview of Paul's writings and his views, Paul was very familiar with the Jesus story, although it is very interesting to compare Paul's letters with the Gospels. Very different focus in Paul's letters from the Gospels that we just finished talking about. I put here on the slide, Paul never mentions the birth stories. He doesn't talk about the parables. He doesn't talk about any of the miracles that Jesus did. He doesn't even mention that Jesus did any miracles or preached parables or taught any certain thing. Paul never talks about the Sermon on the Mount. He never discusses Jesus' arguments with the Jewish leaders. The story instead that occupies Paul's thinking and that he comes to over and over again is Christ crucified, Jesus' death and resurrection, and what does that mean for salvation. In that sense, Paul is actually not much different than the Gospels when it comes to his focus, right? In all of the Gospels, the passion narratives are the climactic event in all of them, and certainly in Mark, the passion, the events leading up to Jesus' death and his crucifixion, and then the actual event of that take up almost half of the book. And in all of the Gospels, you have this major focus in that, and that is by far the longest single story in each of the Gospels. And so maybe this is something that Paul got really interested in and really focused on. Maybe that's what the early Christians were really passing around, were these stories of Jesus' death and his resurrection. For example, if you've ever been to our church, when we're doing communion, the reading that our church uses during our observation of the Lord's Supper, it actually comes from Paul and not from the Gospels. It comes from, what is that, 1 Corinthians 11. And the redeeming power of Jesus for salvation was central to everything that Paul taught and wrote. Paul talks a great deal about Jesus dying for our sins, raising from the dead, coming again to raise believers from death and take them to heaven. It is actually the most important thing in 1 Corinthians. He saves it until the very end, discussion of the resurrection body and Jesus coming back to raise us bodily and take us back to heaven as bodies, not just as kind of disembodied ghosts. Okay, that was super important to him. And so we see that, again, this focus on Christ crucified in the body. He actually died. He actually was raised bodily, and we're going to be like him. Okay, but salvation for Paul is not something that is only experienced in the future event of the second coming. It's not just the resurrection that Paul is concerned about, even though he says that's the most important thing. In this life, believers are made right with God through faith in Jesus. It is in this life that people can receive the Holy Spirit. It is in the present that we can live in a way that Paul describes as a new creation. All of these things happen in the present in our lives in the world today. For Paul, salvation is both now and not yet. We do experience the fullness of salvation, even though the kingdom of God is not yet revealed and it's not fully established in this world, but we can still live as citizens of that kingdom. Okay? Now, going now to Paul himself, kind of transitioning from the themes of Paul's writings to who actually was Paul. What can we learn about him from his letters and from the book of Acts? Paul himself was a complex individual. Okay, I've put here, he was complex, he was even contradictory. There are some things in his letters that are difficult and, yes, even contradictory. I'm not particularly shy about saying that. Okay, there are some passages in which Paul, for example, is a champion of gender equality. He talks in several passages about women being important co-workers with him, about women being leaders in the church and actually personally supporting him. And then we have this famous passage in Galatians where he says, that there's now, no male, female, there's no Jew nor Greek, there's no slave nor free, because all are one in Christ Jesus. And so he obviously thinks that gender equality and other forms of equality are very important in the church. There's no place in the church for these separations. Yet, we also do have these passages that have been used to subjugate and oppress women. I do not permit women to speak in church. Wives, submit to your husbands. Let wives learn in all submission to their husbands. These are passages that have been used as kind of these, proof text or clobber texts to say, that women can't have leadership roles in the church, that women have to, submit to their husbands, and these kinds of things. And so you have kind of both of these sides to Paul. And how do we reconcile those things? In other places, Paul expresses great love and concern for the Jews and for Jewish people. He never has fully given up his identity as a Jew, and he expresses great passion and compassion for his people. Other passages have been used to justify just the ugliest and most vicious, violent anti-Semitic hate. Okay, and so, again, these two sides of things, and you have sometimes in letters written by the same guy, you have these really clashing kind of themes and competing, passages that people are still arguing about now. And if one way or the other was obvious, then you wouldn't have some of the deep divisions that we do see in the church even to this day. In fact, there is this remarkable passage in the book of 2 Peter, and I've given it on the slide there, 2 Peter 2:16, where okay, this other inspired writer, okay, talks about Paul. He says, so our beloved brother Paul wrote to you according to the wisdom given him. Then there in verse 16, picking up, speaking of this as he does in all of his letters, there are some things in them, in other words, in Paul's letters, that are hard to understand, difficult to understand, okay, and the ignorant and unstable twist them to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures. So look at this, okay? Another Bible writer says that Paul's writing is difficult to understand. And even back then, people were twisting what he wrote to suit their own agendas. Amazing thing, okay, that another Bible writer says about Paul. And so we see this, even the Bible itself seems to acknowledge that Paul's writings can be complex and can be difficult to understand, and people can use what Paul said to justify all different kinds of things. Now, I do not think this means that we should not read Paul unless we have a seminary degree. Okay? Anybody can read the works of Paul, and I hope from this study people do pick up Paul's writings and kind of look through them. I also do not believe that everything Paul wrote needs to come with this big caution sign. Okay, we shouldn't think of this as something that's dangerous or something that we should avoid, unless, again, we've been to like specialized training or something. But what I do think is that while everybody should read through the Bible and everybody should read through what Paul says, we ought to be on guard for very easy arguments, very easy interpretations, okay? Usually what that means is that people have made kind of cursory readings of Paul to prove points. Okay? That I'm reading the Bible because I have this agenda, I have this point that I want to prove, and so I'm reading through the Bible and what Paul says for anything that proves the thing that I've already brought to it. Okay, and anytime somebody says that, oh yeah, Paul is absolutely clear on this, make sure we read everything that Paul writes, because it's probably not quite as clear and easy as it sounds. Okay, so we have to be on guard against that. Okay, people making these very surface readings of Paul in order to prove their own points and their own agenda. And we certainly should be on guard against quick and easy proof text methods. Okay, especially when some of these ideas that people use Paul to prove run contrary to those of Jesus or the New Testament as a whole. Yes, there are some passages in Paul's writings that are very harshly critical of Jews. Okay, but if you look at the life of Jesus and you remember that Jesus was a Jew, if we read through the whole New Testament and we remember again that the first Christians were all Jews and that Jesus first directed his ministry to the Jewish people, you cannot use Paul to prove that we have the right to go and bash on Jews or kill Jews. Okay, that's simply not something that you can do, but it is one way that people have used Paul's writings, actually the entire New Testament. But we have to make sure that what we are reading and what we are getting out of Paul's writings also square with the message of Jesus, which is love God and love your neighbor like yourself. Okay, as we're reading Paul, we should keep in mind Paul was a real person. Okay, he had a deep and complex personality, and he was writing. Not only was Paul himself complex and contradictory, but we need to remember that he was writing to very diverse audiences. Okay, most of what we know about Paul comes from the letters of Paul, which were addressed to a lot of different communities. Okay, the letter to the Galatians, the letter to the Philippians, the letter to two letters that he sent to the Corinthians, okay, letter to the Colossians, all of these different places, and these churches would have had different cultural settings. There were different problems in the churches that Paul was writing to, and so some of his advice, some of what he writes, is of course going to seem contradictory because he's writing to these different churches with very different concerns, and a lot of his advice is actually tailored to these local congregations. Okay, another illustration of Paul's sort of complexity, right? We have 1 Corinthians 13, one of the most beautiful passages I think ever written. I think it stands right up there with like anything written by Shakespeare or Chaucer or Tennyson or any of like the greatest poets, the greatest writers that have ever written. 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, stands up right up there with any of them. Okay, and so Paul was capable of doing this. He's capable of these incredible passages writing about love and compassion, and sometimes you can feel like his tears kind of soaking through the page as he's writing to these churches that he loves so much. And in other places, he's pretty hostile and actually kind of crass. In the book of Galatians, I'm going off of my notes now, but I think it's Galatians chapter 5, verse 12. He's arguing against people who are saying, that we have to still be circumcised. And Paul actually says pretty much this way. He says, if you folks are so concerned about a little piece of skin on your boy parts, why don't you go ahead and just cut the whole thing off and save us all a lot of trouble? Okay, his actual words is something like, I wish those who trouble you would go and castrate themselves. And so it's like the same guy who wrote, 1 Corinthians 13, love never fails, above all things, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love, also writes, like, I wish those who trouble you would go and castrate themselves. Just cut the whole thing off and save us all of this arguing. Yeah, complex, contradictory, and yeah, sometimes difficult. All right, now, saying all of that, as I did a quick read through the letters of Paul preparing for this, the thing that struck me, maybe even more than his teachings, even more than his writings and his talks about worship and doctrine, thing that just jumped out to me in all of his letters was just his complete devotion to Jesus. Zeal doesn't even quite describe what comes pouring out in his letters as he talks about Jesus. It is quite moving if you just look at how Paul talks about Jesus, his relationship to Jesus, what Jesus means to him. Jesus is everything to Paul. It is not an understatement to say that Paul is consumed with Jesus. He describes himself in almost every letter right at the beginning as a slave of Jesus Christ. He says that he is compelled to share the gospel. He even predicts that he will die for Jesus, and he thinks of this as a good thing. There in Philippians chapter 1, he says, living is Christ and dying is gain. Okay, if I'm poured out on an altar like a drink offering, then it's all the better for me. Okay, that my life is not significant. It's just Jesus. It's Jesus is everything. In 2 Corinthians, he describes the gospel message as treasure in clay jars. Okay, emphasizing how precious the gospel is to him. It's this treasure, and then also how insignificant he and the other apostles are in comparison to this treasure of Jesus. Okay, when studying the life of Paul, one is reminded of Jesus' parable. I couldn't help but think of Jesus talking about, the kingdom of heaven is like this person who discovers a treasure hidden in a field. And when he discovers that, he sells everything he had to acquire the field, and he goes away happy. He gets rid of everything that he has, and he's happy about it because he knows the treasure that is there. And this was absolutely Paul's experience after he was converted and after he met Jesus. Okay, he gave up everything in his life. He turned his back on every single thing that he was. And he said, the only thing that matters to me is knowing Jesus and him crucified. I find it impossible to read Paul's words in Galatians 2, 19 and 20 and not get swept up in the emotion. Even after all of this time, studying the New Testament, reading the Bible in Greek and all of this other stuff, I still get emotional when I read these words, and I can feel that devotion. I can feel how much Paul just feels this and wants this, where he says, I have been crucified with Christ. And you think of what that means in the first century, what crucified means. I mean, it is the worst, most humiliating, the lowest way of being executed. And he says, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. He goes on, and the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. This is somebody who had a real experience with Christ. And this is somebody who knew about the love of Christ. This is not just an academic kind of a thing. This is not just kind of this intellectual understanding or this academic exercise. This is somebody who is swept away by the experience of the love of Christ and just repeatedly renews his understanding of Jesus, his relationship with Jesus, and the more that he gets of Christ, he can only think about wanting more. And as we go through these letters, if you choose to read through some of these letters with me over the next few weeks, I hope that is something that we can keep in mind, and that's an experience that we can get and that we can want. That we can be inspired to have this relationship with Jesus. It goes up and down, and Christ is there with Paul when he's waxing eloquently about love and about the church and about the resurrection, and Christ is also with Paul when he is just raging at his enemies, at his opponents, and he's telling people, like, go and castrate themselves, and Jesus is in all of that, and Jesus is with Paul in all of that, and Paul is wanting Jesus in all of those experiences. And that is something that I think is something that we can take away from this, and I hope that we can desire that too. All right, so God bless us. God bless us all. Please join us if you can over the weekend as we look at our worship service. And the sermon will be on Paul's experience and looking some more at Paul. Okay, so join us if you can, Saturday at 11:10. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week. God bless you and keep us all.